Welcome to your Handbook for the Apocalypse. This is Mystic Mark with an unconventional pre-show intro. I just want to clarify there are three portions of today's episode that mysteriously got cut out, and I promise you this is not scripted because you might be questioning when you really listen to what we talked about today. But yeah, there was three portions of today's conversation about 2 minutes long where it was just straight static on the recording, and I was very upset. I had to spend a whole extra day trying to figure out how to fix it. Luckily, I saved most of the conversation, and Mike and I are trying to figure out what exactly happened there. But yeah, if you notice the conversation jump at any point, just know that that is what happened. And either way, enjoy the conversation, folks. We plan on releasing this once a week on Thursdays, most likely Thursday mornings. So you AM podcast listeners can get the early bird special. All right. Enjoy this episode, folks. Peace. Hey, Mike, how are you?
Hey, what's up, man? How are you?
Excellent. Just another sunny day over here now.
It's starting to turn into fall, and I'm very excited for that. But we're talking right now. What is today? Today is the 29th?
Yes, sir.
I think it's the 29th. So word on the chatter boards, and so we take the chatter boards with a big caveat, because anything can be said by anybody for any purposes. But that being said, sometimes you hear some pretty good stuff. The word on the street is at least here in America, the gloves are going to start to come off in October. In terms of the levels of mandates and other institutions which can make life more difficult for people. So I don't know if that's going to happen, because that's what I meant, with a big caveat. But I'm also paying attention to that. We're all trying to get our houses in order in the best we can. I would recommend for us.
Yeah, I've heard here and there people saying oh yeah, there's no toilet paper on the shelf.
Probably, well, let's stay here for a moment. Probably, I don't know how much you're following what's going on in Australia.
Slightly.
Well, at least seemingly all of the unofficial news sources, and there's a ton of them which is coming out of Australia. It's getting really ugly over there on many, many different ways, both in terms of violence towards the population, and then also just really, really strict mandates. And all of our brothers and sisters and friends up in Canada, I don't think it's quite that bad yet, but we're seeing that happen as well. And so I'm not necessarily suggesting that's going to happen in the United States. In fact, I would imagine what will happen here in the United States would probably be different. But the point is, a lot of like worst case scenario fears of like what people have been talking about for at least 50, 60 years, it's beginning to show itself. It's seemingly so. So what may be coming, what I probably think it's going to be is like more so about hassles with purchasing, being able to use like Visa cards and stuff like that, and all debit cards use a back end Visa system. Like things like that are going to start getting tweaked. Like, you know, if you don't have a certain proof of certain things, well then, you know, you're going to be locked out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the whole social credit system. I mean, you know, looking at apartments over the past few months, one option that came up frequently was Airbnbs and the extended stays that the Airbnbs offer people. And in my mind, in the back of my mind, you know, in this paranoid, skeptical side, I've been thinking, you know, well, isn't that convenient that they're pushing housing onto an app like this? And if this becomes standardized, I mean, it's as simple as somebody writing a bad review like, oh, this person's, you know, doesn't mow their lawn. And then you get enough, you know, social credit negative points accrued. And then you go to move into a new place and they say, oh, well, you have all these, you know, negative reviews from your last home. You didn't mow the lawn and such. And it's like, are there no second chances anymore? We're just going to walk around with a receipt for every mistake we've ever made hanging from our chin. You know, that's kind of what it feels like we're getting pushed into. But all the news, Mike, you're going to come to learn this about me if you haven't already, definitely from doing this show, is I'll probably be the last person to find out that the world is ending if there is an apocalypse. So that's why I'm really grateful to do this show with you. Because I don't watch the news, and when I do hear stuff, I try to be as biased as I can towards the positive. And that might sound a little ungrounded, but it's just what I need to cope. And that might sound like a fragile state of mind, but I think having the discipline to keep that media out of your mental sphere takes strength. And it's something that, on the one hand, no, I don't have as much to comment as someone else who is keeping up with the news, but at the same time, I think that leaves space for me to entertain other things like this ley line I've been investigating.
Well, no, let me go and respond to what you say before we get into the ley line. So,
sure.
First off, like, that is one of the healthiest things which a person can do is to avoid, you know, the negative psychological impacts of particularly the mainstream news and even alternative news for some of that matter. Solution, like the way they're setting it up, the way it's been set up, and it's been so friggin' clear from the very beginning. I mean, from the very beginning, the internet, you know, it was called the net and the web because it's meant to catch you. It's meant to catch everyone. And so how it catches everyone is it changes their point of reference for reality, thinking that all things need to go through that medium. And that medium, everything that goes over, you know, the internet is going to be, you know, within the realms of being able to be caught, if you will. So being able to live your life with as little to no connection through that and all of the other sort of digital type of platforms and other things, you're not going to be caught. But the one thing, and the reason I bring this up, and so it's going to be interesting, is that we're going to see if like anything happens or not. You know, maybe nothing happens because that's definitely been part of the game plan. You know, that's the part of the psychological operation. What they'll do, if you're a prisoner of war, one of the ways which they break you is on a regular basis. They pull you out of your cell, line you up in front of a firing squad, you know, ready, aim, and then they either shoot blanks or they put the gun down. But it's to bring you through this emotional process of like, oh my God, and then release, and something happens. So like that could be going on right now. So I'm just saying if it doesn't happen now, though, I think it's eventually going to happen, like being locked, not just social credit scores, locked out of systems. And so the new systems, being able to live your life outside of that system is going to be, it's literally the way for surviving it, because you're not part of it. The one last thing I want to say before we go back is this, like going back to the history of what is the internet. The internet as we know it, and what I mean by that is like both the hardware infrastructure that allows us to have all of this sort of like the stuff which we do with the internet, and then also more of the software. It was birthed by two entities. The first one is the Pentagon, and then the second one is CERN. CERN came up with the entire World Wide Web, making like this like binary, like really kind of like programming language infrastructure of the internet from from when its inception in the late 60s, which all is Pentagon. I think it was in the late 80s is when a scientist from CERN invented the whole, like we can put like graphical based we can have a graphics-based interaction as opposed to someone having to be able to like write in code to utilize the internet. And so the point I'm trying to make is it's always come from those institutions. That is the foundation of this entire web, of this entire net. And so depending upon how you see those institutions, it's that should give a good indication of where all of this grew from.
Yeah, and you're bringing to mind portals. When you mention CERN and all of their strange occult symbolism that I'm sure people have heard of many, many times. I certainly heard it on a bunch of different podcasts, but, more local to our area and our story, what you've been investigating for the past however many years, the Hammonasset ley line. And I don't mean to, just abrupt and jump in and cut, but I think it all connects, because part of why I've even pursued this was, because of podcasting, because of listening to all these shows and being inspired by folks like yourself, Mike. And a year ago, I think I might have talked about this, but a year ago, I randomly found Hunter Mountain, just randomly on my journeys, searching for really nothing, just kind of going out and seeing what's out there. And I found Hunter Mountain. I took a picture of it, thought that's interesting, didn't really think much more than that, and then drove back to Connecticut. It was like maybe 2 hours away from where I lived. So I took a little day trip, long story short, exactly a year and a month ago. And then on episode 54 of my podcast, my girlfriend Tara and I were interviewing a woman named Aurora, who is a galactic walk-in, right? And she mentions that this area in New York that I had gone to, Hunter Mountain, Woodstock, that area, is a portal or a vortex. So I'm like, wow, okay. That's interesting. I remember being there. So naturally, Tara and I got more curious, and then we planned a little day trip out there, and we drove to Woodstock. So we drove around, we stopped, we went to this bookstore. And when I was in the bookstore, a book called Spirit in the Stone called out to me. And it was the only copy they had, and it was probably the only book in existence with information on this ley line called the Hammonasset line. You could look that up. There's 2 M's, 2 S's. I'll spell it in the episode description. But if you look it up, the only person who's ever written about the Hammonasset line is this author, and then Graham Hancock, who wrote the foreword to this book. So right off the bat, I'm like, wow, okay, a ley line going through Connecticut, starting at Montauk Point, which connects to the Philadelphia experiment, connects to MK Ultra, all these things, and it goes through Connecticut straight up to the Great Lakes. So that being said, Tara and I, very curious, have been investigating this ley line and mapping it out. Well, we finally stepped into the real world after plotting the line as best as we could. And we went to the border of Connecticut and New York where the ley line intersects the border, because something I think is important when it comes to looking at this kind of stuff are borders, places where two states or two countries interact. There's usually significant reasons why the border's there. All sorts of things can be found. I think borders are just naturally a transition point, and in those transition points we find strange things. So we find this town called Armenia, and it was named by the same guy who named the state of Vermont. Again, borders. The border for the state of Vermont on the eastern side is the Connecticut River. So anyways, we're exploring this ley line, and we find that this waterfall, Kent Falls, literally is on the line. The water flows in the same direction northward as the line. So that being said, we felt the energy. It was interesting. That day, I had a thought to look a little further along the line and see what's in New York. Well, I find out that the Hammonasset ley line crosses through the Susquehanna River in a town called Milford, New York. Now, I don't know if you remember this, Mike, but I'm from a town called Milford, Connecticut. So now I'm looking into this Hammonasset line. It crosses the Susquehanna River, which has been so significant from the beginning for fueling this whole inquiry. And I find that the Susquehanna River and the Hammonasset ley line intersect in a town that has the same name as the town I was born in. So that's all I have right now. There's little details here and there in between, but what are your thoughts on that?
So the first question I have is the author of this book. Like, what do they say is the significance of this ley line?
So it's interesting. Glenn Kreisberg is the author, and his book is not specifically just about the ley line. It's about megalithic northeastern America. So the Northeast, according to this author, is kind of forgotten about when it comes to ancient cultures and megalithic structures. People assume that, it's only Cahokia and the Serpent Mound. So his assertion is that no, the Northeast has just as many, if not more, stone alignments. So he connects the Hammonasset ley line to the Draco constellation. And
okay.
he plots it from Montauk Point, which people might know, Fort Hero, where the MK Ultra experiments took place. That is an indigenous burial ground. You and I know how important burial grounds are, and Ross Ben's work is all about this demagnetizing the grid and how the necromancers, the geonecromancers, demagnetize sacred spots by burying their dead there, and then build buildings on top of sacred places where the indigenous people buried their dead.
Where is the other endpoint?
The other endpoint, now this is even stranger. So I talked about this on my show with a guy named Brad Olson. He's an author of a bunch of different books. Modern Esoteric was one of his most famous books. So we talked about how there are all these copper deposits in the Great Lakes that are, have history into maybe possibly the Phoenicians were using these. So this Hammonasset ley line goes all the way up to a place called Kennesaw in Wisconsin. It's like that one little finger that sticks up off of Wisconsin into the Lake Superior, and it's called Copper Harbor because of the copper there. And it passes over an island called the Manitou Island. Manitou is an indigenous word meaning, spirit. And in Woodstock, New York, and this is the connection that Glenn makes in his book, that it's funny how Manitou Island is connected to this line, and in New York, Woodstock, New York, there's a wall called the Manitou Wall, and it's this huge stretch of mountains that jut up on the western side of the Hudson River near Woodstock, creating the Catskill Mountains, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, the tribes in this area would use this mountain for their rites of passage. They talked about how it had 12 levels, 12 houses to heaven, and only the, purest of heart and the bravest warrior could make it to the 12th peak, the highest peak. So this ley line has spiritual significance going back to the, original cultures that were here. But Glenn only writes about it in one chapter, and then he moves on to the correlation between the Overlook Mountain in the Catskill Mountains and the Serpent Mounds, and how both have stone alignments that map out the Draco constellation. So, and then he moves on to discuss other spots throughout the world and connecting them to the Northeast. But he really only mentions the Hammonasset line in 2 chapters, the 3rd chapter being the one that has the most information. So now here I am. I'm like, wow, I'm thinking all of these, everybody's already figured it out. There's nothing new. But in my own backyard, there's the Hammonasset ley line that has only really one chapter written about it and no articles. There's a gentleman who knows the author, who lives in Connecticut, who kind of brought this to the author's attention. But other than these 2 guys, I seem to be the 3rd person really interested in it who,
right.
Has or might have the opportunity to do any writing about it.
So first off, the whole idea that it's all been discovered and all figured out, just crumple that up. There's no,
right.
There's nothing further from the truth of that. There is a period though where we learn from other people and it brings us, and that can give us clues on our own sort of journey, and particularly if you're a researcher, so keep that in mind. A couple things which are, first, this question: have you read The Gaia Matrix?
No. Is that by David Icke?
No, this is by, I don't know the guy's name. It's French sounding. It's Peter French sounding. And so I'm not going to try to go and butcher that name, but I know I've spoken about it ad nauseum in past videos, and I thought that maybe you and I had talked about it. But the entire book is about all of the ley lines in New York, New England, and all of that stuff. And he does an exquisite job laying it out. It's got a certain perspective of it, and it's really interesting to read because I think it was written probably in the mid 90s. It was definitely written before 2001, before 9/11, and so there's a different flavor there, and to me at least, it becomes clear, to see how general consciousness has changed from that event. But nonetheless, it is so friggin' highly recommended. And to put in context, with what you're talking about. So there's that, and I'll get you that information. Gaia Matrix is what it's called. It's got maps. It's got all sorts of great stuff. It has a lot of really key points happening right around the Finger Lakes, the Finger Lake region of New York. The second thing I want to point out is Milford, New York is probably 8 miles due south of Cooperstown,
right,
which is the source of the Susquehanna. So it doesn't necessarily just cross the Susquehanna at Milford. It crosses the Susquehanna at the very least within the first 10 miles of its beginning. But you could even just be less specific and say it crosses at the source location. And so I would say that's a pretty big.
Through the Susquehanna State Forest, New York's Susquehanna
State Forest. So then the next thing, though, I want to bring up, and this is a general question, which I'm going to pose to you. It's so what's the importance of ley lines? Why does it matter? Why is this a significant to you? What do you think ley lines are, and why should we care?
Right. So maybe 5 months ago, I wouldn't have had as good of an answer or as a confident answer as I do now. But since visiting Wissahickon Creek with Ross Ben and feeling the energy of the mound that he took us to, it's palatable for me. It's more tangible for me. Now that I have his sort of discernment to be yeah, this is a mound to me. Now I have a better gauge on my compass that might have indicated that energy to me, but I wouldn't have been able to place it as well as I can now. Now, not saying that Ross is the end-all, be-all or the mound expert, but he's certainly done a lot of work, and I trust his opinion
I
on
listen
it.
when he talks. Definitely.
Right. So since then, I think, that was a really big moment. It clarified that feeling for me, and kind of reinforced that I was looking in the right direction. I would say ley lines, I think on an energetic level, draw people to them, hence why there are structures, built on them. And that's kind of where Glenn came to it with the stone alignments. My thought is it must be a route for people to travel, because it crosses through, at least 60 bodies of water, from rivers to lakes to ponds, reservoirs. Obviously, some of those are man-made now, but that was another thing I noticed with the ley line, is it's just packed with water. So if someone were to travel from the Great Lakes to Long Island Sound, which are two, amazing places, really, I'm sure before the colonists got here, extremely abundant, So that being said, I think on a historical level, it's some sort of way for people to organize their migration, because it's celestial, it's aligned with the stars. We know people use the stars to at least understand their place, if not completely navigate. But I think in conjunction with the stars, they were able to use a path like the Hammonasset Line to travel, because they, every so many days they would find another stone alignment confirming they're on the right track. They would come to the Catskill Mountains, see over the Hudson River, and know they were, close to Long Island Sound. So, not that I've made any treks like that and have any, understanding of what that would take, but I think from my perspective, it's extremely thought-provoking, and it's drawing my curiosity more and more every day. So that's why I feel like it's powerful, just the curiosity. And also, Bard College and Colgate College are both built along the Hammonasset Line. Not sure what the significance are to those colleges, but I know Colgate is definitely named after an important guy, maybe pertaining to the whole fluoride thing. Also, Plum Island crosses the Hammonasset Line, very particularly important to what we're dealing with today, all the experiments they did on Plum Island. And then next to the Susquehanna State Forest, there's a mountain called Mount Vision, which is like, all right, here I am on my vision quest, and I find Mount Vision in Milford, New York, in the Susquehanna State Forest.
Those are some really interesting ideas and thoughts. And undoubtedly, I think that like ley lines play a part in terms of navigating travel, I would say. And I would say, yeah, there may be stone markers, but maybe, at another time, or maybe even happening right now, but just in a different frequency, just as you described how palpable you felt the energy at Wissahickon Creek, like it would be that obvious where these ley lines are. In fact, I would even suggest that before the compartmentalization of our 5 outer senses, by labeling them and thinking of them as 5 different senses, that's a compartmentalization process. There's not to go down too far of a tangent, but I'm going to circle back. The idea of synthenasia, and synthenasia is when the rarity, and I say that with air quotation marks around it, that when a person's different senses blend together, they smell colors, they hear. I don't know. I was going to say they hear sounds, but that's obvious. But that's an indication of once all of these senses were together, and we were probably the sum total of all of these senses gave us a completely different experience of reality. And so it is probably from that, we were able to, or human beings were able to pick up these ley lines in a very, very tangible sort of way. That seemingly that's a logical conclusion to me. But I think that's also just a simplification of maybe what the human experience may have been like in a different sort of environment on Earth. And I don't think that ley lines necessarily just point to navigation for those reasons. And like, maybe all sorts of things, navigating related to that sort of stuff. I'm going to go back to where we began. I gave a little soliloquy on the internet and, where it came from and who it came from. So part of what we need to do during this time period, I call it rewilding consciousness, is this ability to look at things from a different perspective and a different, and outside of the conditioning in terms of how we've been taught to interpret reality. So all that being said, like, it goes both ways. You can look at stuff within the false reality and you can reverse engineer something else. So if we go and we look at the internet as a concept, this web of on the most basic level, permanent fiber optic connections between different points, which are able to then, from these different nodal points, connect all throughout Earth. That's not a new friggin' idea. Like, there is nothing in the false reality which is new. All the false reality can do, like, by definition, a false reality cannot create. But what a false reality can do is, like, either replicate or invert, which is, a type of replication. So we go and we look at the internet, and we can go and ascertain that what the internet is, this interconnection of what it's primarily used for is information sharing and receiving, like, that exists. And on one level, we could look at and on a very material level, we can look at both, like, the interconnection of all of the mushroom root systems within a forested area, like how that is so interconnected to share information, and then also throughout the entire wooded ecosystem, like just how it shares information. Like, we can see that. We're like, oh, that's kind of like the internet. Like, that's a pretty easy sort of comparison. But I'm going to say, like, no, that's just like one of the many, like, fractal replications of something maybe a little bit more foundational. And what that foundational system, what that foundational connection of web of energy, of light, because that's what the internet is. The internet is just over fiber optic lines. It is replicating artificial light. And what we're actually seeing, another version of the internet here on Earth, on a different level of experience, is what we're calling the collection of ley lines. And so I can't say this from actual experience. Right now, this is just conceptual for me. But as we need to move off of the internet, like, part of the trickery of the false reality is making you think that this is the only way in which you go and experience life. Like, as you get kicked off the internet, as they try to bribe you to stay on to using that, you need to have something else to step into. And that's part of the fear. It's like, oh God, this is the only thing. Well, I'm introducing the idea that this is what the ley lines are. And so everything which we can do with the internet, and we should be able to do in a natural way. And what I'm going to say that means is being able to access information and store information. Now, it's not going to be as refined as the internet, because that's what we see in the false reality. It takes something which is naturally occurring, and then it refines it until it's weaponized. Like, we could look at, like, a lot of, like, drugs that way, of, like, how they've been refined into cocaine, and now it's, like, kind of weaponized against you. But there is a foundational truth there. I don't necessarily think that our experience with a naturally occurring ley line internet, if you will, or the internet is actually, like, an inversion of the ley line network. But at some point, out of necessity, we are going to discover that all of the benefits, all of the ways in which we connect with people, we know where to go, we share information, and we access it, has to do with this ley line network. And I'm going to say it also corresponds, as you said, or, like, interacts with, like, more natural, like, water, or more material, like, water networks. And they don't necessarily line up exactly, but there are significance. And so and this would be my encouragement to you, like, you are on this vision quest right now. You are like, you are probably in one of like the main interchange areas. In internet speak, they call them metropolitan area exchanges, and like these main places where all of these networks intersect. That's what I understand, or that's the way I see the Northeast is. That's why it is so significant. And so part of your journey, like as you're learning and experiencing it from all of these other ways, like start being open to these ideas and looking for like, what are the potentialities in a very, very material way in which this information or this understanding, this other way of looking at our reality, like how does it really serve me in my life, in my body at this particular time, where I can go and really create or be part of the creation of another reality on Earth. So that's kind of my thought on the issue.
Wow. Yeah, I love the connection between the Leyline network and the network that we're all connected to, even the phone network that you and I are talking to each other. I mean,
it's all the same.
Yeah.
It's all the friggin' same.
Well, it's funny because it brings up these notes I kind of have about the teachings of Don Juan Yaqui Way, written by Carlos Castaneda, a person that came up in the podcast that I asked the listeners to check out in between this episode and last week's episode. You said you checked it out. I'm happy you did. Thank you.
Let's go right into this because we're flowing. So run with it. Run with let's go down into the podcast and like the information which corresponds to Castaneda.
Well, first of all, for the listeners, thank you if you did go and listen to that podcast, because Uncle Mike and I are hoping to create really a podcast here that interacts with you in your real reality, and maybe even anchoring you into a more real reality through listening to this. I don't know, just my thoughts, not something that me and Mike huddled about, but either way, something that really profoundly affected my life was Carlos Castaneda's work, his books. Obviously being born in 1994 was after his death, and all I could really interact with were his books and maybe other people who have also read his work. And it's interesting, there's many books written about his books, and one of them is by this guy Victor Sanchez, and I love his book because it really breaks down the whole Carlos Castaneda series in a sort of technical, practical, step-by-step way. And
what's the name of the book you're referencing?
It's called The Teachings of Don Carlos, Practical Applications of the Works of Carlos Castaneda by Victor Sanchez.
Awesome. Okay.
And he breaks down a concept that is mentioned and talked about a lot throughout the whole series. And that's the difference between the Tonal and the Nagual. And I think this is really cool, this connection, because a lot of your work, Mike, connects to the Toltecs. And the Toltecs are, really the inspiration for Don Juan's whole knowledge base. I mean, his culture connects to the Toltec culture. So this idea of the Tonal and the Nagual being the normal, ordinary reality, or the two bands of fields of energy, so to speak. They call them the eagle emanations, but you can understand it like a field of energy. And Don Juan says that there are only two bands available to us. There's the band of organic life, and then there's the band of inorganic structures, and then this third sort of non-ordinary reality, which is our soul and maybe even the higher parts of our mind. So I think the internet, in a way, is like taking the Nagual and anchoring it in the Tonal, like creating a sort of artificial matrix, something that we talk about a lot. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that breakdown and those two concepts?
I think it's a real... I think it's a big concept, and it's something which I've spent a lot of time on, and so it's a personal favorite one. But I'm going to focus more so on what you said the internet is kind of like this intermediary between these different different frequencies or dimensions or whatever, or ways of being, or whatever, however we want to go and describe that. And I think you're absolutely right about that. And it becomes very clear when, I brought up before the connection, the historical connection about the internet and CERN, and, just like, what the hell are they even doing in CERN, and what is that? I'll go back, my personal research is like, this all began with like the John D. Enochian magic stuff. And I think that those are other words, Enochian magic and thinking John D, but they're kind of describing the same thing as described in like the Toltec language, which you're talking about. I think it's a fascinating topic, but I only got too far off. I want to hear how you're going to go and link this back to the podcast, which we all listen to.
Well, I wanted to create a little bit of a connection point, because I think the perspective of the podcast is a little more focused on the story between Christina, this actress, and the director Frederico Fellini. But they use Carlos Castaneda as a sort of, known figure. So I just wanted to clarify that,
right.
Even though Castaneda did, become somewhat of a cult leader, a lot of the work that he did initially was inspired by this Toltec culture that, describes so much of what we're talking about today. So I just want to make that connection. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So, okay. Walt, you want to give like a quick synopsis of the podcast and the book they're making reference to? Right.
So
get us all on the same page.
Right. So they're talking about a character named Frederico Fellini, who was a director in the 1970s, 60s, 80s, around this time. And in 1984, he became absolutely enamored with Carlos Castaneda's work, just like me. When I was 17, 18, bought a bunch of his books, started reading them, and it really colored my imagination. This mystical desert came to mind. So
hold on, let me interrupt you for just one second, just to kind of lay the framework. So the podcast called Mysterious Universe, which you're going to have linked in this episode also, is about these two dudes who have a perspective. They have a very kind of metaphysical perspective, but they're also, I've never heard them before. They're British guys, and they're both very metaphysical, but they're also skeptical. And they're analyzing a book. And the book they're analyzing, I think it's called
Towards the Moon with Fellini.
Towards the Moon with Fellini. And so this is a nonfiction book telling the account of a certain experience which involved, the two primary characters were Fellini, who's a world-renowned film director at the latter part of his life and career, a woman who I was not familiar with, and then one part of the story has to do with their interactions with Carlos Castaneda. This is the book is written that this is all happening. This is not fiction. These are actual events. And so what I think we're going to get into right now is not just the analysis of the book, but more so the analysis of the people analyzing it, and then our own experiences with it. So with that said, let me hand it back to you.
Yes, and I should point out that they're Australian, and they're Australian, and they definitely have a very. I almost feel like it's MythBusters. It feels to me like the show MythBusters. If you're familiar with Jamie and Adam there on that
I've
old
never
show.
seen it, but I know what that show is, and yes, that it was. I found their analysis rather that in itself was noteworthy to me, because there are certain things which they're really, really suspect of, and then there are certain things that they just accepted without having any sort of analysis. Yes. So I was like, wow, there's a real inconsistency there, but nonetheless, I enjoyed the ride. We at least I try to have an approach that I can learn from everyone, regardless if I agree with them or not. So this is independent of whether I agree with their conclusions.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you as well. I think the show it's funny. It's got its own taste, but I take from it, a lot, and it inspires me what they do with the book. So either way, yeah, I
That's the
don't.
most important thing.
Yeah, and so they're talking about this whole saga between Frederico Fellini and this actress, but more importantly, they received these phone calls. Okay, now the phone calls.
Which is the nature of where this what Fellini and this actress, like why they met each other, like what they shared, like the whole purpose is this web uh, from these phone calls you're about to tell us about.
Right, right. So, like you pointed out, Mysterious Universe definitely looks at these books from a more skeptical perspective. So the fact that these phone calls are coming in, that's like the point of the podcast. So folks, I hope you listened to that already. If you didn't, go listen to it now. It's free, and then you'll know a little bit better what Mike and I are talking about. So this voice starts calling Fellini and Christina, and it calls itself you, as in Y-O-U, you, and it has a sort of metallic voice. And
this is the days before cell phones. These are like old fashioned phones.
Right.
Like they lift up the phone and there's this strange voice and it's telling them stuff to do.
Right.
And they find out later on that they both are receiving it they both are receiving similar calls. And again, remember, this is position. This is not a Hollywood story plot. This is what their experience was.
Right. And the synchronicity seems to be the theme, but as the story progresses, it seems like the synchronicity is more manufactured than you initially think. So Fellini, like I said, enamored with Castaneda, and he happened, he's an Italian, so he was near Rome, and it happened that a friend who knew Castaneda calls him up and says, Castaneda's in town. He wants to meet with you. He wants to talk to you. And Fellini's like, wow, that's amazing. How, what are the odds, So he jumps at the chance. And I think they didn't end up meeting, but they did sort of talk on the phone and make plans that they were going to do this movie. So Fellini makes plans to go to the United States. He ends up in the United States, in New York first. And that's when this woman, Christina, receives a strange phone call from you, which tells her, like, you have to go. There's going to be a director. This director is going to basically, change your life, and, like, it'll be good. So, she's sort of a new age type chick, and she's got, her head sort of in the same place, even though I don't think she's familiar with Castaneda. But right off the bat, she meets Frederico Fellini and they hit it off. She's interested in the sort of metaphysical, and he's very fascinated with this whole saga and Castaneda. So they meet up despite, sort of the rest of the people in their group being like, okay, you two are weirdos, And long story short, this voice starts leading them around. It calls Fellini, it calls her. They end up down in Mexico. The voices call. The voices start asking them to sleep with certain people in the group, right? So a lot of strange things happen. But Carlos Castaneda and Frederico Fellini, Christina, they never end up getting together. There's nothing that happens. There's no movie. Nothing happens. It's sort of a letdown, it feels like. And I wanted you to listen to this because this idea of synchronicity being manufactured seemed to be the theme. And I think, maybe that's the perspective added from the, two hosts that are the Mysterious Universe, and maybe that's how they feel about it, because they did kind of make a comment on the harmonic convergence that seemed like, it was like, oh, Christina heard about a harmonic convergence, and then she said that it came and passed with little effect, and they kind of laughed at that, like, well, duh, like, of course it didn't do anything. So you get the idea that even though Benjamin and Aaron the hosts of Mysterious Universe, even though they talk about this stuff a lot and they're very familiar with all this stuff, they still have a huge degree of skepticism towards the other people who also appreciate these subjects, which is a little, I don't know, it's off-putting in a way, but I don't know. Not my intention to comment on them, but yeah, the manufactured synchronicity, this idea that they're being like led around to make this movie, and then it never happens, and then Castaneda passes away, and it's like, to me, my thought is maybe there is something mystical that wanted that energy to be, that was what I first initially thought listening to this podcast. Like, oh, something's calling this guy to make a movie about Castaneda's books, of course, So let me stop right there and see what you think, Mike.
All right. You did a really nice job laying that out. So the first thing I want to comment on is your observation of kind of how they how the hosts of the podcast set up the narrative and their own kind of like chopping down of some of its validity, specifically as you were talking about the harmonic convergence. I don't know what happened to the harmonic. I know what the harmonic convergence was, but I can't say one way or the other, what happened or did not happen there on a grander level. But when you introduce this idea of like them as a myth buster, and again, I'm going to say this, not necessarily saying like this is the case, but this is what pops in my mind, is in the entire realm of controlled thought. People fall in different parts of the paradigm, and a big part of the controlled thought, operation is that you hit people at each place on that continuum. So the person who's going to listen to this podcast is going to obviously be interested in esoteric or paranormal ideas, but they also want to be rationally reassured that there's nothing to see here, folks, or if there's anything to see here, folks, it's all just a bunch of malicious trickster pranksters from different dimensions.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm like, because one thing that they did mention, I wonder if you caught this, and I hope people caught this, is the part about the stamp of cloth that was given back to Fellini. And then he looks at the stamp of cloth and he's like, that looks just like the lining of my hat. Takes his hat off his head, and that exact piece of cloth was punched out of his hat. So it's almost like there was an element of, clear, like that doesn't add up from that Mythbuster perspective. So they almost like they take that at face value and then kind of shrug it off and continue. Because I don't want to let the cat out of the bag just yet, but I did buy a subscription to their Plus show just to find out that cliffhanger that they left us with at the end of the episode.
So now I did not. So I'm curious to hear what was revealed in there. But you are absolutely right. And that's why I made kind of like the point in the beginning, saying like this is not a Hollywood story, because when they were telling the story of what the book is about, I was like, that didn't happen. That's magical realism. That's Field of Dreams type of movie making. But it is positioned in the book like it was that level of synchronicity. So it's okay, what exactly is happening? And so the takeaway, and I think it is an interesting takeaway. I think it's a very, very interesting takeaway, particularly in light of what we're talking about with there being a natural internet or an earth with ley lines, is the fact that just because we see, something which is seemingly controlled from outside of the material realm, like that in itself does not universally make it trustworthy, I suppose. In the same way, just because you see something on the official sanctioned news, Like, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true.
Right.
It just means, like, and that whole sort of fallacy of authority. And so in this instance, the authority figures would be anyone that exists outside of our experiential reality, three-dimensional reality. Like, they're all like, we should listen to them. Like, we should still have some critical some critical thoughts, and particularly, and I thought they brought the whole point of the whole story, which I almost felt was like a bit of a dud, was like this voice, it seems seemingly out of a movie, which they keep on hearing from their phone, is just kind of sending them on a wild goose chase. And so the truth of it being, particularly as we explore with greater and giving it greater weight, new ways of interacting with reality, that we should have our own mechanisms in terms of like recognizing what we should listen to and what we shouldn't, or how much significance we place to it, and I think that's a really valid point to bring up. And what they said, which I think makes a lot of sense, is like, if it appears to be a wild goose chase, like if you're following all the signs, but like nothing's ever happening, and your life is kind of like, this is going to be tricky to say. If your life is starting to fall apart, well then maybe that's something you should think twice about. But then and this is why I said it's going to be tricky to say. On the flip side, part of what we are experiencing right now globally is to see all of the stability of our lives, that's being taken down. And our stability has been built upon something that's false. That was the whole idea of like your life being like completely based upon apps and online banking and shit like that. That does need to happen. Like, if you don't get off it at some point, you will go where it takes you. And so there is a flip side that says, like, if your life is falling apart, maybe it's the places where it needs to be. And so this is where I think this is such a thoughtful discussion that we're having right now, because it's not like a yes, no, easy answer. Like, it requires some real pondering and self-examination, both within one's own life, like their life experience, independent of the collective reality, and then also how it intersects with the collective reality.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That, I mean, it's hard to follow, not only hard to say, but yeah, I think no. And it kind of brings to mind like everything I've been doing with this, like following the synchronicities, becoming almost like a synchronaut, like someone who journeys with the synchronicity or into the synchronicity. And you hear a story like this and you're like, well, are some synchronicities manufactured, like, are they pulling people towards a certain aim that is for the desire of like a larger consciousness that we're not aware of? Maybe that consciousness is smaller, like an elemental or something. Now we're getting into, categorizing what these things are. I mean, how could we really tell? But I would say, it did bring up the sense of like, well, could this be like some kind of spirit talking to them through the phone? But yeah.
So we're going to go back to the spirit thing in a moment. But what I do want to say now is oh wow, I just lost it. It was a great idea too. What was it that you just said? You said the about the
manufactured,
getting lost, the
synchronicities.
manufactured. So one of the things which the hosts pointed out was how it brought out a lot of like negative emotions, jealousy, and like distrust and anger and all this sort of stuff. And if you go back and you look at who these particularly Fellini and the actress
Christina.
They were both heavily vested within our cultural value system. Like, they're celebrities. They were like, they lived like the good life. That's probably Fellini's best known work is La Dolce Vita. And so part of what the authors or what the hosts were indicating were that their thought was, maybe there's something on the astral plane, if you will, that when we are filled with a certain degree of creativity, openness, and negative emotion, we shine very brightly, and like that will attract astral sort of tricksters, if you will. So what I would suggest, particularly to the point you just brought up about, trusting synchronicity and things like that, if there's any sort of validity to that argument the host brought up, and I think that, at least logically it makes sense, is that when you're not kind of in that darker
up is the Heyoka, the trickster, and how we can be, and I think, you might have been on the Union of the Unwanted.
I heard when you were talking about it.
Right. So for those who don't know, Mike and I were both on the Union of the Unwanted this past Monday. Please go check that out. Union of the Unwanted, great podcast. But side note, that whole episode is about spirituality and this idea of the Heyoka, the sacred clown, the trickster, and its necessity to sort of reveal the higher truths. It's like the whole idea of the apocalypse impersonated, in a sense, the truer meaning of the apocalypse. So that's partly where I think we're going to navigate with this podcast, is exploring that theme maybe a little deeper. But it's just, it's very interesting to me that there can be this sort of interplay, and I think the host did sort of have this expectation that it was nefarious, but I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think what it is something like a Hollywood movie, isn't honoring or maybe treating something like that with the sacred approach or respect it deserves. So nothing like that is ever going to be made, because it doesn't have pure intentions. It's about going back to the real, going back to what is natural. That's when we find a relationship with this higher force, this sacred energy that Don Juan teaches Carlos Castaneda about through his book. Now, maybe this is the right time to let the cat out of the bag, and I do encourage
let the cat out of the bag.
I do encourage people to subscribe to Mysterious Universe. I don't want to go and Men in Black, who she finds out were allegedly associated with Carlos Castaneda's cult, and they tell her, you're the chosen one. You need to, be the new leader of the cult with, I think it was Castaneda, but it might be after Castaneda died and Frederico Fellini and Christina were supposed to take over the cult. But that's how they ended it. They were like, oh, see, it was just Carlos Castaneda and his meddling cult, So I felt a little bit like, oh, man, that's how it ended. I was expecting something a little more interesting than that. But yeah, I mean, that was the letdown for me too, as somebody who was a fan of his work, and then finding out after looking into him a little further, like, it seems like he didn't have a great end to his life. It seems like some strange things happened to Carlos Castaneda, and it's not really clear either, and I think that's evident of maybe somebody getting too close to the sun, so to speak. Like you get too close to the truth, and the forces that be co-opt you, and cults are kind of like an ARG, a very extreme version of that, where somebody comes in and programs your reality, over a process of a short amount of time, and then completely changes your life for the worse, right? And, to bring up ARGs again, I think that's kind of like what happened to Frederico Fellini and Christina in a way. Like, they got put into this game that was being, directed by this force, this you figure that kept calling them on the phone, through the artificial network, the matrix of information. So what are your thoughts on that?
So first off, is you're 100% right about Castaneda. He's I find his works fascinating, and I've spent my time with them. But then, like, just as you said, when you delve into him, both in terms of him being everything from being a fraud. So one story is about Castaneda is like, he made up the whole shit, that there's no such thing as Don Juan, and he made up the entire story, but maybe like mixed in like, his own experience of like Toltec teachings. There's that. There's good evidence about him being like a CIA operative, either a knowing one or an unknowing one, aka a useful idiot. But then what is also very clear is, his life he did not seem to live a happy life. And that seems to be a theme in a lot of very, very strong esoteric personalities. Like, you think of Aleister Crowley, you think of, that
who also had his time in Mexico, strangely enough.
Exactly. So, I mean, at the very least, I think there's a lot of arrows that all point to Mexico or Central America or Mesoamerica, and some of the previous cultures there is containing like access points to another type of reality. So it's that is something which at least I'm aware of in my life path, is like recognizing these sort of at least stories which were told. And then secondly, though, like to counter that thought is going back to what I said a little bit earlier, is if you truly are going to get in alignment with higher truth, and you're still trying to live within a reality which is based upon a false reality, in fact, almost like an inversion value system to higher truths, it's going to break it down. So it's like, okay, I found all these higher truths, but I'm still maybe trying to live, the grand life on the material level, and that those two things cannot exist, and something's going to break down. And so a lot of times that would be like the life of living within this reality. And the other side, or where the opposite side of that coin of what I just suggested would be like, well, look at like anyone who follows an aesthetic, I think that's how I pronounce it. Someone who, regardless of what their religious affiliation or philosophy may be, but they reject everything within our culture to live like a very, very simple life. Those people can't lose anything. Like, they've walked away from it. So like, those are kind of like the different sort of points, viewpoints, which I look at this whole sort of this conversation which we're having right now.
Mm.
But what I wanted to do was then tie in my own experiences relative to kind of this storyline, which I'm still suspect. Like, I mean, like, just because she says it's nonfiction doesn't mean she didn't make up the whole shit. Or some part, like, there's always that, because it does seem a little bit I don't like, at least I'm going to be open to that as a possibility. But as I was listening to the podcast, I could not help but reflect upon a pretty recent event or series of events which has been happening in my life.
Right. And something.
Want me to go on?
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about it, and I think people who've heard you on the Higher Side Chats may know part of the story too, because you have talked about it there. But go ahead.
Yeah, I talk about this quite a lot, and the reason I talk about it is because it's, you know, at least when it shows up in my life, it has been, you know, a pretty bold flash in the sky, which you can't really miss. So you need to talk about it. So the long and the short of it is, I began receiving packages in the mail. I've received 2 packages in the mail from someone, and the first package had a poem written about me, really like well done, and it was filled with like Masonic imagery, and there was a silver coin. And then a couple months later, I got a bird cage and a glass bead. And I'm pretty certain, I would say with 85% certainty, I have met this person. I know who's sending this to me. So like on that level, like there's not like a mystery, like who's on the other end. Like I'm pretty certain I know who is on the other end. But that being said, to add to, there are multiple levels of this story I need to set up. You know, I do another show with Emily Moyer, and we do a weekly show together, me and Emily do. And then me, Emily, and Howdy Mikowski do a monthly show together. And Emily and Howdy began receiving packages from the same person. And, you know, we were, what this person is doing is, they're, on one hand, you know, they're creating an air of mystery, like how did this package show up? How did you get my address and that sort of stuff? But it's really not that difficult. Like if you like look at all of the events in our lives that led up to the receiving of the packages, it wasn't that hard to get the addresses and the steps, if you pay attention, which this person used, like they become evident. And so one of the questions I ask myself, and you understand why, like, you know, rather than just writing it off and just saying, oh, this is just like, you know, like some, like either like an obsessive fan or just someone playing who wants to get in on the action and play a game. You know, whether there's some elements which are more than just that. So the packages that each one of us received were immensely personal. And what they were personal to is just topics which we have discussed on air. So anyone who pays a lot of attention to any of our shows, and if they're taking notes, like, you know, they could create something which is very impeccably well done. Like each of us received these packages like a profession, like the most detail-oriented wrap job, everything like the paper and the thoughtfulness of the gifts and the quality of the gifts. You know, the gifts were probably ranged like anywhere from like $25 to maybe $150. Like there was a lot of thought and effort that was all put together. And so you've got that element. And then where it gets interesting, though, is all of the packages were received, like the timing of the reception, when they came into my life, when they came into Emily's life. And I don't know, I can't speak so much for Howdy. He's a little bit, he keeps his private life a little bit closer to the vest. So I can't say this with 100% certainty for Howdy, but I can say it with 100% certainty about me and Emily. Was the timing of the packages was absolutely dovetailed perfectly with events that were happening in our private lives that this person should have absolutely no insight into. And so this is where it starts to get like really like synchronistic or coincidental, or like what the hell, you know, what is going on? And some of them were to the point where you couldn't say like, well, maybe your house is bugged and they're listening to that, like other things, like other people who are disconnected who would say something like it would have to be a management system if this was like orchestrated or seen that was multiple levels above not just my life but other people's lives as well. Like it was really, really strange in which these packages were received. And then the other thing which is paralleled to the story which we heard on the podcast and what the book was about, was that this entity, or whatever we want to call it, which they called you, labeled each person by a color. Each person had a color. And this idea of identifying people by color is we've seen a lot in popular culture, and what's popping in my head right now, like, you know, the first thing which I'm thinking about is in the movie Reservoir Dogs, you know, where all Quentin Tarantino films are really, really like deep with like cultural programming, but all of the characters were just known by colors. Like, you know, that would be an example in popular culture in terms of like colors. Well, me, Howdy, and Emily, we each received a glass bead, and that fits into the show which Emily and I do. It's called Playing the Glass Bead Game, but they were all very color oriented. And so at first, when I received it, I didn't think that much of the colors of each of our beads, but in the context of the model which was illustrated in this book about Fellini and Catherine and Castaneda, they also had this like color notification for each person. And so let me go in a couple. I want to go like 3 levels. I'm going to finish this level right now, and I'm going to add something else, and then I want to hear your thoughts on it. So all of that happened. Like, so I'm watching that. I didn't have a kid. I'm listening to the podcast, and this really strange interaction with this person who I think I know who they are, and they're what they do in material reality is at best a little bit suspect. I'm like, wow, this is weird. I don't know where I'm going to go with this, but I have a parallel to this story in my own private life. So that happened on, I guess it was probably like Thursday of last week was when I listened to the podcast. And so that was completely, that's when I started thinking about all of these things. Like, you're like, oh, wow, look at this reflection with these weird packages I get. You know, is there any similarity? Why did Mark like bring up this podcast of all these podcasts? Like, these are the questions I'm holding in my head. So that being said, you know, I have a regular life. Like, you know, I've got a family. I live with other people. And within my household, there are also 2 young girls, you know, ages 8 and 10. And that evening, we had decided to watch the first part of a movie. And this movie was, you know, it was chosen for the girls in like an age-appropriate movie. And that movie is called Nanny Mcphee. Have you ever heard of this movie called Nanny Mcphee?
Well, only because I have many female cousins and a sister. So, but I've never seen it. But yeah, I think
right. Like, I've never seen it. Like, and in fact, like, it was like just on the outskirts of my memory of pop culture. I'm like, this kind of sounds familiar. I think I know. I know what it is, and my brain works that way. Like, I know a lot about pop culture, which I don't know the details. I just know it exists. So I'm like, all right, I'll sit down. And I always enjoy like that. I enjoy that experience, like watching the movie with the family for a variety of reasons. Like, you know, some just like, you know, because family time is very enriching. But then also I'm like, all right, what am I going to learn? And I particularly like watching something I would never choose myself. So I'm like, okay, let me go watch. And keep in mind, this is the exact day in which I listened to that podcast. Well, this whole fucking movie, Nanny Mcphee, is all about, like, it has a lot of friggin' similarities to this story which you had told me, or which we listened to, this podcast. So let me walk you through, like, what Nanny Mcphee is about. Nanny Mcphee is, there's widower, this man who's got like, I don't know, like 7 kids, and his wife dies, and 17 nannies come through, and the kids get rid of the 17 nannies because they're so horrible to the nanny. And then this Nanny Mcphee comes, and then she like, you know, she like changes the family, and she's very, very kind of like, there's this mystical element. She just appears, and and how it begins is the widower, the man, the husband or the father, he starts hearing this voice. He doesn't hear it over the phone, but it's very, very similar, that like wherever he turns around, he hears this strange voice that tells him, Nanny Mcphee is who you need to find, Nanny Mcphee. This is exactly the same thing, which the same modus operandi in which these voices are calling Fellini and Catherine and saying, you're going to meet a director, there's this person. So it's the same idea of this mysterious voice coming, and they're like really confused, and then a person shows up who meets it. So within this Nanny Mcphee, and like, you know, he goes through it's a feel good movie, like, you know, it's exceptionally well done for what it is, for like, you know, this type of like children's film, and I'm going to get into that for a moment. But if you're paying friggin' attention to the details of this movie, and this is why I said we're going to go back to, you mentioned like they thought that it may be a spirit on the other voice. The entire movie, Nanny Mcphee, is about communication with the dead. It's about communication with the dead. And why do I say that?
What?
So what happens is you find out like one at the end of the movie that Nanny Mcphee kind of implies that it was the dead wife, the dead mother that brought Nanny Mcphee there. So that's like alluded to. It's alluded to by the Nanny Mcphee character is talking to an empty chair, which is where the wife sat, and she was talking to her as if she were there, and she was like, I did what you asked me to, or something along those lines. But then we go and we step back a little bit further. What was the occupation of the father, of the husband? Well, he was a mortician. So they're telling us that this guy is already like deeply connected with the dead. And then when you go, the highlight of the film was the climax was a wedding which takes place. Finally, the father meets like a wonderful replacement, an approved replacement by the dead mother, and they get married. And it was in the middle of August when this wedding takes place, but then this mystical snowstorm blows up, and then everyone's covered in snow, but it's done like they're not freezing or anything. And it's like visually, it's very, very like, you know, whimsical and appealing and beautiful. But I'm watching it, and I'm like, I already figured out it's all about the death. About the dead, because I'm like, why else is this guy a mortician? I'm really looking for like all of this dead sort of stuff. And then I'm looking at it, I'm like, this is the same flavor as a Tim Burton film. Like the way, like the scene director or the scene creator made what this wedding looked like, and with the snow, it looks just like something out of like, you know, the Nightmare Before Christmas, or any of like Tim Burton's films, which are always about death and the other side and these sort of things. So we see that again. And then also when you see at the very end of the movie, Nanny Mcphee, the way they show, like it kind of like morphs into animation, and they show the silhouette of this Nanny Mcphee, and they show her like with horns, like kind of like it looks like a devil. Like there's an implication whether it's like the devil himself or herself, or whether it's just more like a trickster god, if you want to go and look at it that way, because that's certainly one way of understanding what Satan represents. But this is all of the symbology. I'm going to go one more level because I know I'm giving you a lot, and then I'm going to stop, and I want to hear like all of your different thoughts. So this is where it gets even more interesting. So Nanny Mcphee was a movie, and it was really, really well done. The caliber of actors that were involved were very high level, like I guess you call them grade A or A-listed celebrities. So Emma Thompson, Academy Award-winning actress, was the main character. Colin Firth was in it. Angela Lansbury was in it. Side note, Angela Lansbury is very significant because you need to see her in the film called Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and it's all about like satanic witchery. Like, that's another conversation, but she has that connection, and she plays a key role within the film. But nonetheless, I'm watching it. I'm like, I know these actors have done films together before, and I remembered what movie which they did a film together. All of these actors before, and sure enough, the same people who made this movie I'm about to mention are the same people who made Nanny Mcphee, and so it just stands to reason, like, you know, from a very logical, this is how the world works perspective, is like, oh, these people work together, the directors and like the producers, and so like they all know how each other work, and there's good chemistry, and so let's do that again. So you could look at it that level, but we're going to go a little bit deeper. The film which they all did together before, and it came out, I want to say, about like 5 years before Nanny Mcphee in the early 2000s, was a film called Love Actually. Are you familiar with Love Actually?
No.
All right. So Love Actually was a film that came out in 2003, I would imagine. It was like a Christmas feel-good movie. It came out of the UK. And a general rule of thumb, which I use by understanding popular culture, which comes out of the UK, when it's done exceptionally well and it's exceptionally well received, you can bet that it is a Tavistock Institute project, and it's part of mass mind control. They are the top of the pyramid. And I would say this film, Love Actually, like as soon as I saw it before I became aware of like Tavistock and how the world worked, but I went back in time and I saw the film again, and I was able to say, like, this is fucking Tavistock work altogether. So Love Actually is, and it begins where they're talking about, when the towers fell on September 11th, we thought there was no love in the world, but we are actually finding out it's all love actually all along. And then they interweave like 5 or 6 different storylines in this beautiful way. And like, everyone leaves feeling great about the world. This is what they needed to go and introduce in the early 2000s. So this is where it gets friggin' weird. So I know and I'm not going to spend that much time going into much more detail about why I know that Love Actually is part of the, large global programming industry. But I know that. I've reached that conclusion, at least. I am satisfied within myself saying, like, this is a fair conclusion to reach. So what is so fucking weird about Nanny Mcphee is that not only did they didn't use all of the actors from Love Actually, but they used a bunch of them. And they have the actors in the same friggin' archetypical relationships. And so let me give you like the most glaring example, and then I'll stop. So within the family of Nanny Mcphee, there was an oldest child who's kind of like the ringleader of all of the children as they would act out against the nannies. And like he was at first the biggest obstacle to Nanny Mcphee doing what she needed to do to save this family, but then eventually he came around. And so this is a little boy whose mother had died, and he's working with everything which a child would go through in that experience. That was his role in Love Actually. His role in Love Actually was his mother just died, and the actress who played Nanny Mcphee, Emma Thompson, in Love Actually was the sister of the father of the boy. Like that was replicated exactly. The husband in Nanny Mcphee, who then he eventually married his housekeeper. The exact same actor did the exact same thing in Love Actually, marrying or falling in love or proposing with his housekeeper, who was a different actress but looks exactly the same. And so the point I'm trying to make with all this, and the reason why I'm bringing this all together, is like there is to my eyes, there in the three things I just told you, both like the packages which I had been receiving and Emily had been receiving and Howdy had been receiving from this character, and then the timing of listening to that podcast and then watching the same movie same concept being played out on a movie totally randomly, and then seeing that this movie is completely tied into the instrumentation of behind the scenes mind control. It's like, that's exactly what the podcast was about. It's like this intermingling between like actual synchronicity and controlled synchronicity and all of these different sort of things. So I don't exactly have like a final point or conclusion that based upon these three things, I'm now going to go and do this, but I am recognizing a real-time parallel, which is giving me, I guess, at least reason for thinking in a new way between like the conversations you and I are having and then what's unfolding in my actual life.
Wow. Well, perfect timing. The loud, noisy furnace that's down here just shut off a moment before you started talking, or before you stopped talking. Yeah. Wow, Mike. I think the connections there are actually exactly what, is the fun of being a part of this whole synchronistic, like noticing that it's like, oh, okay, it's the magic of awareness, which is something that, to bring up the first book I mentioned, Victor Sanchez. I mean, the whole series of the Carlos Castaneda books, Don Juan is constantly getting Carlos Castaneda to sort of shift his awareness and stop his ego from preventing his awareness from like sinking into this Nagual, the real reality that's all around us that we're never really conscious of with our traditional common senses. But yeah, it's just, but where I transition that is like what you mentioned about Castaneda being connected to the CIA. I mean, his whole book really was a lot to do with why I maybe tried psychedelics, like his book definitely brought those plants to my life with a little better reputation than all the other sources I had heard it from, so now I have this series of books that are really cool and fascinating. I'm like, oh yeah, I'd love to try that stuff, so to that extent, knowing what I know now about the music industry and how they were pushing drugs on people, I mean, yeah, I don't put it past Castaneda to be a CIA agent, because I think his book definitely, discusses these things in a way that is not the right approach, so to speak. Like, just reading that book isn't enough to be prepared to then go on a spirit journey. I think, you actually should go to a tribe and get peyote yourself, from a rite of passage, the right way that they've structured, rather than just like, oh, I read this book, now I'm going to go find this on the street and trip out for a couple days. Not that that's what I did, but it's definitely, an influence on my life looking back. So I don't doubt that there was, a sort of manufactured nature to me finding those substances and then taking them. But, I don't think I'm worse off for taking mushrooms, because now here I am, understanding certain things that maybe I wouldn't have without that experience. So it's tough. It's the reason why I think this is the revealing too, because we're understanding the forces that are at play better than ever.
Can I respond to what you said? Because you said some really interesting things.
please.
So, like the entire counterculture movement, and particularly its correlation with psychedelics, has been very, very well documented to have been a CIA operation. And you could then go like, well, why is the CIA doing it? Who's driving that? That's another question. But we can say that we know that from like all of the work Dave McGowan has done. Like that's a really good thing. But then also the beginning of psychedelics, introducing the idea of psychedelics into the adolescent collective consciousness. It came from a Time Life article. Like in the 1950s. Jan Irvin does an amazing job, like when he explains that history and like how Time Life is connected to like Skull and Bones and all this sort of stuff. So that was always kind of like that was this idea of unleashing psychedelics into the mainstream American adolescent mind has always been there, and there's a lot of strong arguments as to this is the reason why, like, the more they sell you is like psychedelics is entheogens. That's a CIA word, like the idea that that they're calling a psychedelic like something that connects you closer to God, like that was a sales job, like. So it has been used as a counter reason to say, like, all right, this CIA, this dark stuff, I ain't going to do this, because part of like the negative or destructive conclusion of introducing these very, very powerful reality busting mechanisms to an unprepared, an unmatured psyche is that it gets you fucked up for life, potentially. But this is the line this is the line. You described it yourself. You said, I wish, the ideal way would be to go and sit with and experience culture and people through the use of these instruments, because these instruments can very well break down false reality. It's not the only way, but they can do that. But you do need to have have it in a controlled, well done environment. Like, the people who are leading you and then guiding you before and after, because it's a crapshoot. What's going to happen? And so that was part of it. So I'm going to step back and I'm going to say, like, yeah, what is happening, this revealing which is happening is, if it's going to be managed, like this is one of the ways you're going to be managed. All right, people are going to be waking the fuck up. This is how I get ahead of it. I'm going to go and create the scenario. And maybe like 15% of the people who go into it, they're going to go down a path and they're going to be kind of like lost for, we could write them off. But for those who are able to go through that, and so, and I would say this is also the truth with the Castaneda books, is like, on one level that could like really like screw up someone, but then on the other level, if you're not screwed up, there's a lot of friggin' treasure there. There's a lot of treasure. And what you're describing, the way you're describing your process, and particularly like looking at where you are now in life and what you're doing, and particularly how it's one, successful, but two, like not part of the mainstream, is like, this is kind of like what it looks like if you go through it. You through your own discipline, you through your own chance meetings with other like teachers in your life. Like I'm thinking mostly about the guy who you met at Yale University. Like this is the other way. Like it's like they brought you to this scenario, and unlike the friend that you mentioned to us last week, who was just like, maybe not utilizing these instruments of reality destruction in a way that serves him, or in a way which he grows just as like kind of like a cool ass experience. Like you didn't do that path. You did another path, and this is where we find you. And so this is kind of how I see the role, this really kind of like contradictory relationship between the controlled counterculture movement done by intelligence agencies and then the actual life expanding perspective experiences that can come through these natural tools, these mushrooms or cactus or so forth. Like, that's how I see it.
I agree. Yeah, I think the nature of life unfolding, it's for you to decide, obviously what decisions you're going to make. And when these influences come to the forefront, I think it really just takes your heart's discernment to be the judge. That's why I kind of pointed out, like, well, their movie never got made, and maybe the idea of making a movie about this thing wasn't a good intention anyways. I mean, you look at a lot of the movies that you analyze, there's always an intention behind them, and uplifting consciousness tends to be maybe 15% of the time. I don't know. Maybe from my perspective, 85% of the time, they're planning some sort of deception or some sort of reality shift that they want to, in a sociological experiment type of way, play out, this theater of the mind. They give people characters. Those are archetypes. They then live their life through those archetypes. I wonder if the Carlos Castaneda series as a movie, would have worked against the ever-present they, not to get too paranoid, but their plot against us to sort of diminish that connection between us and a higher reality or a higher self, the real. But yeah, I think, on the point of Nanny Mcphee, it doesn't surprise me that there are those connections. And it kind of sounds like the same thing, like this spiritualism that swept the 19th century America, Another episode I was listening to, not to bring Mysterious Universe back, this is not going to become a Mysterious Universe commentary podcast, but they were talking about this group of kids who started, doing seances and got in touch with this Dr. Bindeloff. And this Dr. Bindeloff would, do these seances with these kids and give them instructions on how to build these devices that then they would use to better communicate with Dr. Bindeloff. And then these, when they got a little more, into the seances, some things started happening. Then Dr. Bindeloff left and some darker forces started communicating with them. And then, they all just kind of grew up and gave up the seances. And then, one of the kids that was involved in these seances, meeting Dr. Bindeloff, he goes to this medium and she says, well, this is you. You're Dr. Bindeloff. You've become this person, that was you from the future sort of communicating with yourself. So that to me seems like it's a mix between the spirit of the land and our higher self, and the mix between the two, in Carlos Castaneda's place, it's for his instance, it's very much the land and the personality of Don Juan that portray this sort of universal wisdom. You can find this in all different corners of the world, shamanism, different forms of it. And it's all talking about the same thing, it's getting to this actual reality, and with this cultural overlay that we're all born into, this false reality that we're all born into, something like shamanism seems really appealing, because it's like, oh, wow, that's like what we're really supposed to be living through. And then you have all these dead end paths towards it, right, that they've set up, it seems like, with the music festivals and the hyper sexualization and the hyper dopamine drugs that they put out there, all trying to decentivize the more natural versions, like you said, cactus, mushroom, fungi. These are the actual plant teachers, the pure versions of which, just like we kind of got to the beginning, how they've alchemized and concentrated things to their almost most potent, but in the same way least natural place. Like we shouldn't demonize that plant. It's the form that plant has taken through the man's process of it, turning it into the powder that makes it addictive, makes it deadly. Really close friend of mine just lost his younger brother to cocaine, so synchronistically that came up for me this week. Thoughts and prayers to him and his family. But yeah, it's definitely, that when you're faced with that side of it, the whole substance family can get the bad rap. It's like people are like, oh, it's all the same, don't use any of it, look what happened to this guy, he died. But I think my larger point is that you being yourself, not the guy on the phone manipulating Frederico and Christina, but you listening, you are the judge, getting in touch with your heart. That's kind of what my life has shown me so far. I mean, would you say that's true for you, Mike? Like your heart being the compass, that once you figure out your heart's compass, then you can start to navigate things and discern things in a truer way?
All right, that's a big question. Let me ask you this, and I think this would be a kind of like a nice way to begin to wrap up our conversation. So, what do you mean by the heart? And I'm not like challenging you. I'm like, I want clarification so I can answer accordingly.
That's a good question, because I think I do use that term, and it is subjective. So to me,
and that's fine. Like it's totally fine to use subjective terms, but we need to define so I know what your subjectivity is, so I can put it in context.
Yes. So for me, I would say my heart is a sort of mode of thinking. I mean, to logically analyze it, but it's a feeling associated with a phase of consciousness where the thoughts I'm having in that moment are directly in correspondence with my emotions in a way that feels extremely not satisfying, but like the word truth kind of sounds cliche here, but just knowing, a sense of knowing, right? And I think confirmation, after feeling that once, you have experiences that then confirm it for you, and then you're able to sort of, have a better grasp over where your compass, so to speak, is pointing you to in that kind of magnetic way. So really, I think it's your sort of knowing, not your ego, not your id, but like maybe that layer in between your consciousness and your higher consciousness.
I think that's a great way of describing what you mean, and maybe like listening to you say that, tell me if this is also a correct way of describing it. It's not the feeling is not that of anxiety or confusion or conflict, like, oh, it could be this or it could be that. There's like, you're describing kind of like an integration, which you then feel solid with stepping into.
Right. And like an awareness that the thoughts you're having about that, whatever it is that's present in your mind, are true to your collective, cumulative experience so far.
Right. That it's integrated. Well, what you think, what you've experienced, this is right. There's no conflicts. Okay. So if you use that as a definition of like kind of like heart knowing, I think my personal experience is a little bit different than that, but I also think I'm 30. How old are you, Mark?
I'll be 27 in 13 days.
All right, so I'm 23 years older than you. So all that means is I have 23 more years in this body of experiences, of opportunities to fuck shit up. So with that being said, like within my experience in my life, there is I've gotten to where I have gotten. What I mean by that is my understanding of reality. I don't mean that in terms of like status or anything like that. But I've gotten there by just looking at things that I find that interest me, like I'm naturally interested in, and completely independent upon of like how can this like benefit me? Oh, I'm going to go learn this because it'll be good for my career, or like something like that. And then being able to interpret it based upon my and trusting and not needing like the validation from something external. And I think that's very similar to kind of like what you're describing. Like I would have described it differently, but it's the same in terms of this like kind of integration and comfort level with my own kind of interest, decisions, and so forth, just based upon how I feel about it. I'm interested in it. This is what I want to go and learn. I will add this though. This is probably a little bit more unique to Mike. Is the way I go about a lot of life. I rarely do I go the most direct, efficient path. In fact, almost never do I go the most direct path. I always take the path of least resistance. And that has often led me to places where I'm like, how the fuck did I get here? But then it always brings me to the right place. And so I've learned to trust that. And I would say that couples in very much to my story. And then I'm going to say one last thing about like how I know that I don't go the direct path. I have a great sense of direction. I'm really, really good at giving directions. I love when people ask me for directions. I love like, oh, how am I going to get from this point to that point? Like even in my own town. What I have learned through just my own observation is that my instincts to get from point A to point B, and particularly in comparison to like, let's say my ex-wife, she's probably the best example. Her instincts to go to a place were always the most direct ways in the way. And the ways I would always think were always the most indirect ways. But if there was ever like traffic, or if there was an accident and roads were closed, she was totally friggin' lost. And all of the ways which made sense to me were wide open in the ways to work around. So one of the things which I've learned about myself, and the reason I'm sharing this detail is, just in terms of as we're describing how you found your path, or how you found like your navigation system on the path, is it's going to look a little bit different for everyone. And if you study your ways of going about things, and you do it with like an open but then a non-judgmental way, like I'm open, yeah, like I choose the fucking most indirect way to go from point A to Z, even though I think it's the best way to go. I know that about myself, but I also know these are they serve me in a completely different way, and so I trust that. I've through experience, and so maybe this is at least how I'd like to maybe end up our conversation today, is just that idea. I share that as an example of what it looks like as someone who can analyze their own behaviors with detachment and acceptance.
Right on. Yeah, no, I'm grinning over here because I feel like I've had the same sort of driving disputes with people in my life where I'm like, I know how to get there. Don't question me, but we got a lot of traffic where I live, so been there for sure. Yeah. But yeah, so I think, I agree. That is a great place to leave off. And yeah, I think navigating this podcast, navigating our own lives, something will come up in the next couple days before our next episode. And
certainly. How about this? Is there a way, if someone's listening to this at home, that they could send you like, hey, why don't you talk about this? Is there a way that people can do that?
There is a way. People can go to podinbox.com/MFTIC in capital letters, or just click the link in this description and leave us a voice message if they're brave. But if they'd rather just write a nice message, they can go on Instagram. Follow Susquehanna Alchemy, leave Mike a message, or probably better to leave me a message. I'll probably get to it at My Family Thinks I'm Crazy on Instagram. But someone has emailed us in the past couple days saying that they love the show. So we've got some good comments, and yeah, shout out to Travis up in Montana. And then there's one other guy, sorry that I'm forgetting their name, but I'm trying to find them in my Maddie R. Shout out to Maddie R. So people have commented, but no messages yet. Just people saying they love the show.
If they want to hear us talk about something, definitely throw it out there.
Cool. Right on, Mike.
All right.
Well, it's been
Mark,
a pleasure.
It was always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. And I look forward to the next one.
Right on. Take it easy, Mike. Thank you for listening to another episode of Your Handbook for the Apocalypse. I'm Mystic Mark, and with me today, of course, was Uncle Mike, as usual. You can find more from Michael at Susquehanna Alchemy, susquehannaalchemy.com, his YouTube channel, and of course, for those who want to get the full scope of things, go over to his Subscribe Star and support there. And if you want, support this show too, Your Handbook for the Apocalypse, by supporting me, Mystic Mark, on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Go to myfamilythinksimcrazy.com. We're about to hit our 100,000th download pretty soon, so if you are listening on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast feed, thank you so much. We appreciate you. And be sure to subscribe to the Susquehanna Alchemy podcast feed in the episode description so you can get the Your Handbook for the Apocalypse podcast. It's going to come out every week there. Okay, we're going to do it every Thursday. We record on Wednesdays and we're going to talk on Thursdays. And we hope to do something cool like we did last week, where we give you guys something to go and listen to or to look at, and to look forward to us talking about and breaking down in the next week's episode. And it's really fun. Mike and I do this over the phone, which is a new way, or an old way, bringing back an old way to do this kind of thing, as opposed to using Zoom or another way of doing things. So I think this show in itself is going to be unique and different, and I'm excited. This is only episode 3, and so far Mike has loved every episode. I've loved every conversation, and I hope you feel the same way. So stick with us, support us at Susquehanna Alchemy, search that, or just subscribe. I'll put the link in the description. And the other link I'm putting in the description is the pod inbox. That's right. Leave us a message and you can be on the show. podinbox.com/M, capital F, capital T, capital I, capital C. That's right. MFTIC in all capital letters. There's 2 inboxes there. You can leave one for this show, or you can leave one for the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, which, again, thank you for listening. We're about to hit our 100,000th download, and our year anniversary is coming up as well. So be in the zone and stay tuned for the newest episode coming out soon. But again, thank you for being here. We love you. Peace out. This has been Your Handbook for the Apocalypse.